Iran didn't have an army. And Saddam Hussein had airplanes, he had tanks. We don't have weapons, but we have God on our side. He would run ahead across Iraqi minefield. Tanks would strike at them, okay? Helicopters would come in and strike at them. There's a group in Iran called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, okay? Or the IRGC, okay? We will call them the Revolutionary Guards. And what's interesting about them is that they are separate from the army, okay, the military. So where do these guys come from, and why are they separate from the army? Well, it goes back to 1979. Remember in 1979, there was a popular uprising against the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, and the government brought back Ayatollah Khomeini from exile to run the country. And Khomeini at that time was afraid of the army because the army had sworn allegiance to the king. So to deal with this problem, Khomeini established another armed group called the Revolutionary Guard Corps, okay? And what they do is actually very different from the military. The military has an obligation to protect the nation. But the Revolutionary Guard Corps has a responsibility to protect the revolution, the Islamic Republic, okay? Which means ultimately that they are Khomeini's private army. They only obey him. And the other thing about the revolution is that not only were they trying to bring an Islamic Republic to Iran, but they were trying to export the revolution across the Middle East. Okay? So basically, the Revolutionary Guard Corps had two main functions. The first main function is to protect the Ayatollah and ensure the revolution succeeds in Iran. But the other function is to export the revolution to the Middle East, okay? To spread Islamic revolution to Syria, Iraq, and that's why the Middle East was so disturbed and so angered by the revolution, all right? Now, this was why the IRGC was founded. And because so many countries considered Iran to be a threat, they encouraged Saddam Hussein to invade the country in 1980. Okay? And this started something called the Iran-Iraq War. And it was not just the Americans who support this war. The Soviets also support Saddam Hussein, and the Middle East countries like Saudi Arabia also supported Saddam Hussein. It was a brutal war, and a lot of Iranians died. But ultimately, the Revolutionary Guard Corps was able to protect the revolution from foreign invaders. And because of that, they became the most dominant military group in Iran. And so they almost had unlimited access to funds, okay? Not only to protect the revolution in Iran, but also to export it overseas. Okay, so does this all make sense to you guys? But with so much power, they eventually became corrupt, right? Today, people believe that they control about 10 to 50% of the entire Iranian economy. And because you have such a monopoly of power, it meant that over time, the economy stagnated, okay? Now, Western sanctions, American sanctions, played a major role, okay? Iran couldn't really sell its oil overseas. But the real problem was the fact that you had a monopoly of power, this Revolutionary Guard Corps, controlling the entire economy. And the Revolutionary Guard Corps had arrested or exiled or executed the officers of the military because they were not seen as loyal to the revolution. They were seen as loyal to the Shah. Okay, so Iran didn't have an army. And Saddam Hussein had airplanes. He had tanks. He had lots of soldiers. And everyone thought that the war would end very quickly. But then what the Revolutionary Guard Corps did was they organized a new army called the Basaji. Okay? The Basaji. And this was a volunteer army of poor religious people from the villages. And what the Ayatollah Khomeini said to them is, we don't have weapons, but we have God on our side. Okay? The Iraqis have armor, but we have divine power. And what they did was, to these villagers, and these guys are about your age, okay? They're 16, 17, 18. And they gave each of these guys a rifle and a key to put over their necks, okay? And the idea is that this key is your entry into heaven. Because when you die in war, you are granted automatic entry into heaven. And so these guys, and they were organized into groups of like 22, okay? They would run ahead across Iraqi minefields. Tanks would strike at them, okay? Helicopters would come and strike at them. And they would keep on running. And of course, they would die, okay? Because they didn't have any armor. But the Iraqis spent so much ammunition and bombs on them that eventually the Iraqi army became exhausted. Okay, does that make sense? And so they withdrew. But then Iran took the fight to Iraq. But this shows you that the main power in Iran, why Iran is such a powerful military, is that their Revolutionary Guard Corps are run by fanatics with a passion for revolution. And they're supported by the Bajazi, who are these poor, illiterate religious volunteers. And there's tens of millions of them for Iran to draw on. Okay? And what the Revolutionary Guard Corps has been doing after the Iran-Iraq war is they recognize that if an enemy comes attacks Iran, people are going to die. So they want to take the fight to them, okay? And that's why for the past 20, 30 years, the Revolutionary Guard Corps has been supporting conflict in the Middle East. Okay? They started something called the Axis of Resistance. So the Axis of Resistance includes Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Syria, the Assad regime in Syria, as well as Shia militia in Iraq. Okay? And so all the money that the Revolutionary Guard Corps makes in Iran is then sent to this axis of resistance to create conflict against Saudi Arabia, United States, and Israel. Okay, does that make sense? But so you can imagine that there are some people, and there are actually a lot of people in Iran who are like, why are we doing this again? What if we withdrew from the Middle East and just focused on our own economy? Then Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States wouldn't have a reason to attack us. Okay? So there are people who who are thinking like, maybe the problem isn't Israel, maybe the problem isn't the United States, maybe the problem is these guys because they're fanatics. And they're creating all these problems in the Middle East, which is crippling our economy. If we stop these conflicts and just focus on our own economic development, then maybe our people will be better off, okay? And one reason to think that there are people in Iran, politicians in Iran, who are extremely skeptical of Revolutionary Guard policy in the Middle East is that in January 2020, remember that General Soleimani was assassinated by the Americans, right? The Iranian response wasn't that big of a deal, okay? The Iranians basically didn't respond. Whereas the Revolutionary Guard Corps, because their leader was killed, they demanded vengeance, right? They wanted to go to war. But we can suspect that it was the politicians like Raisi who basically said, no, guys, let's be patient, okay? Going to war against Israel and the United States right now is suicidal. So they were urging caution and restraint. And the Revolutionary Guard Corps didn't like that. And then April 1st of this year, the Israelis struck the Iranian embassy, right? Which made matters worse. And again, at that time, I'm sure the Revolutionary Guard Corps was, let's just go to war. And again, I'm sure Raisi and his team said to them, guys, we cannot beat the United States and Israel in a war. Let's be strategic about this. Let's be patient. Our time will come, but we need to be patient. Okay? And I'm sure that because they're fanatics, they were like, they are in our way. These politicians are cowards. They're weak. They're soft. They're not believers. Let's get rid of them, okay? And then what happened on May 19th was an opportunity arose where there was fog, and they were like, well, here's our opportunity. And so they caused an accident. Okay? Does it make sense, guys? All right? So again, I don't know what happened. But if we look at game theory and we examine who would benefit from the death of Raisi, this group of people, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, would most benefit because it is very likely that if Raisi became the next supreme leader, their authority and their policies would be challenged. Okay? And so by getting rid of Raisi, it makes Mojtaba Kamani, the son of the Ayatollah, that much more probable in ascending to the supreme authority. And that allows them to maintain their power, the monopoly of power. And even if this accession causes a legitimacy crisis, well, it's good for them because then the regime is even more dependent on them. Okay? Does that make sense? So during these protests, especially the Green Movement, the Revolutionary Guard Corps was the ones responsible for cracking down. And they were violent and brutal in cracking down.